Hey everyone. Okay, so we'll look at um, discourse today, and we are looking at Foucault and how Foucault's idea of discourse was used um, to understand the discourse that we're studying now. This is by McCall. This is called Foucault Primer, I think. Foucault's Primer. Foucault Primer, yeah. So this is this book, Discourse, Power, and the Subject. Right. So understanding what discourse is according to Foucault, uh, we look at this first, right? He thinks of discourse in terms of knowledge. He doesn't use this discourse as a part to do with the linguistic system, but as a part to do with discipline. And his discipline is divided into two understandings. One is scholarly disciplines, and the other is disciplinary institutions of social control, such as the prison, school, and hospital, and so on. Now, this is very on par with what Althusser was saying, right? Disciplinary institutions, he was one. I think, yeah, in the ideological state apparatus and then repressive state apparatus, this is what Althusser was talking about. So Foucault integrates much of that understanding also here, and then social control, which brings in Bentham as well. But yes, let's not go into that. We're looking at discourse. So, okay. So before, in order to clarify what discourse is for Foucault, we need to address these following questions, right? How is the term discipline being used in the traditional disciplines, right? What is the basis in Foucault's earlier work for his complete reconceptualization of this idea of discourse, and what are some political possibilities opened up by the rethinking of this concept? Basically, he looks at something very, very foreign to us because we've always I'm talking about this in a historical sense. We've looked at discourse in a very traditional sense. Right, so let's move on to understand the non-Foucauldian concepts of discourse. This is this part, right? So Foucault's approach to discourse can be called a critical approach, since it geared toward counter-reading of historical and social conditions offers possibilities for social critique and renewal. This can rarely be said of the non-critical approaches stemming from linguistics, right? So linguistics is more to do with the explaining, the analyzing what is there for us to see, what they observe in the language world. But Foucault's understanding is far more critical, is what they're saying, right? For the sake of exposition, let us separate these non-Foucauldian approaches into two groups, right? So there's the formal and the empirical approach. English-speaking readers are more likely to be familiar with these two groups of approaches, perhaps, than continental ideas about discourse as knowledge. Yet it will be worthwhile to clarify how forms of discourse operate, right? The formal approach to discourse analysis considers discourse in terms of text, right? Its main precursors are the linguists Harris and Mitchell. Following Harris, formalist discourse analysts work with variations of formal linguistic methods of analysis. Following Mitchell, they're interested in the social functions of the language and often use naturally occurring samples of language usage as data. The formalist discourse analysis is therefore very close to the discipline known as sociolinguistics. And the ethnography of communication, again, at other times, the formal approach is not called discourse analysis, but it's also called text linguistics or text grammar. This variation, rooted in Russian formal school, connects it to various forms of French structuralism, right? So Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, and early Barthes, to which Foucault's, who is a post-structuralist treatment of discourse, runs counter. Despite this history, there is a sense in which formal discourse analysts can be critical, right? For example, the systemic functionalist school of linguistics associated with Holiday whose theoretical notes are located in the Russian formalism, has recently been rethought by such analysts such as Hodge and Kress to generate a new approach called social semiotics or critical linguistics, right? This type of discourse analysis does not always relate to French critical discourse analysis, right? Yet it offers a variation or a version of formal linguistics, which reads naturally occurring texts as socially classed, gendered, and historically located. Yeah, right. So let's move on. More importantly, Halliday has been used and rethought in relation to feminist theory and practice. By example, for Threadgold. Threadgold's critical feminist linguistics has challenged simplistic arguments against, for example, the gendering of pronouns. Instead, it has argued that discourse analysis should not examine how language in general is gendered, but how gender differential forms of access to particular registers and genres, ways of using language have become normal and dominant through such historical processes. So we should hesitate before we reject all formalist versions of discourse analysis out of hand. In their own way, they offer genuine possibilities for critical intervention, though at a different level from Foucault's analysis, right? This is what Fairclough is saying. Fairclough was known for critical discourse analysis, CDA, and yeah, right. So, but the possible critical and political uses of formal linguistics are only one side of the coin. At another extreme, this formalist approach is very mechanistic, right? That is, it attempts to find general underlying rules of linguistics and communicative function behind, as it were, imagined or intervened texts. In this way, the idea of discourse in this discipline becomes quite narrow and very difficult and different from Foucault's. It's much less of a diverse social and epistemological phenomenon and more of a formal linguistic system in its own right. For this reason, it seems to relatively require a narrow linguistic description. One extreme version of formalism, also known as speech act theory, assumes that behind forms which perform a particular function, such as speech acts, which there exists a more general layer of pragmatic competence which has rules. So speech acts, just to give you a small idea, is by Austin, and he looks at it under pragmatics and not discourse per se, but it's part of formalist approach. And the job of speech act theorists is to discover this, right? Hence, Perrow's, right, actually performed utterances are only a minor consideration, and the primary focus is instead the discursive system underpinning them. This system is different from, but formally like the long, right, the language systems. Discourse becomes effectively a kind of grammar. Yeah. Yeah. In the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault specifically differentiates this conception of discourse from that of the speech act theory, and indeed from logical analysis, which tend to consider language in terms of prepositions. Since he's not is interested in conditions of discourse, Foucault does not mean by this term a formal logical linguistic or even language-like system, right? So if the formalist approach to discourse are mostly associated with the discipline of linguistics, empirical approaches, by contrast, largely consist of sociological forms of analysis. In this tradition, discourse is frequently taken to mean human conversation, right? So like certain kinds of formalism, some types of conversational discourse analysis offer formal descriptions of conversational texts. Yet, this is not its only or its main goal, for it is primarily concerned with the common sense knowledge of which ultimately inform conversational rules and procedures. In this respect, empirical approaches to discourse can be seen as Foucault's concern with discourse of knowledge. But from the outset, it is clear that by knowledge, these analysts mean something different from Foucault. In the tradition, knowledge refers to the technical knowledge or know-how. Yeah, for Foucault, knowledge is much more matter of a social, historical, political conditions under which example a statement count as true or false. Yeah, there's a large range of empirical approaches to discourse analysis, right? So we were looking at the formalist approaches, and then we were looking at the empirical approaches, right? These are the two in non-Foucauldian methods, right? That we are looking at. So in a sense, what the formalist structure is talking about is the conception of discourse as a text, as a product, right? It's very close to linguistics, and it tries to make things very non-contextual. It looks at diaxis, it looks at speech acts, and it's quite abstract. So it looks at the structure, the formal form of the word, the structure of the word. That is what it tries to understand. Whereas for empirical, right? So this is what we're talking about. They're looking at far to do with common sense knowledge. It's the common sense, the common know-how, the technical know-how. And it's more human-centered, it's more sociological, experiment-based and all of that. But it's still very different from how Foucault views knowledge, right? Let's say that. So these are some examples here: conversational analysis, and then coining the term ethnomethodology, right? All very empirical. So let's move on, and we'll look at okay, we can look at here, whereas the concept of archive is quite distinct from the idea of empirical data, which is like a corpus, right? Corpus is body of data. Foucault's archive is not just a collection, but the form of organization of the parts. It's much more than a corpus. It goes a little beyond where Foucault is concerned, right? By the word archive, I do not mean the mass of texts which have been collected or chanced. This is what Foucault is saying. He doesn't mean the mass of texts which have been collected at a given period or chance to have survived oblivion from this period. I mean, the set of rule at which, at a given period or definite society defined. Right, so these forms and limits refer to limits and forms of discursive formation. This is important because while many of Foucault's analysis use, like CA, meticulous and detailed textual documentation, this documentation in itself is not what Foucault means by archives, right? So it's not documentation, right? It's more to do with the documentation, the organization, and the arrangement. Right. So classically, CA's version of discourse looks for techniques of saying how turns are taken in conversations. For example, by contrast, Foucault's discourse theory looks at the techniques of what can be said. That's all to do with the non-Foucauldian discourse, right? So basically discourse in action. And yeah, we will next look at Foucault's rethinking of discourse, and then the Foucauldian method of discourse.